struggle with the church being designated as non-essential. It'd be like watching a fireplace on the screen. You can see it all, but you can't feel the warmth. And it doesn't have the power of that. And so you can't dismiss being with people. We need to do that.
We should continue to do everything we can medically to overcome this pandemic, but at the same time, I think we should start reopening and get back to our economy, social life, spiritual life, medical life. We need to get back.
The administration, as well as healthcare professionals, have been saying that it is safe to open or reopen. We're going to be a little bit more cautious because we want to respect the safety and security of our followers, as well as the priests and whoever else may be coming in contact at the Monday.
I'm a member of the executive committee of the Mass Board of Rabbis, and so we very quickly issued a statement as well saying that we didn't feel confident that any of us could maintain our spaces in a way that we're safe.
We wanted to participate in what is essential to us, communion on Palm Sunday, but observe CDC standards. And so we went ahead with it, even though we were declared non-essential. I love this city. I love the people. I don't want anybody endangered. Long story, we participated, and we were already in violation of the state and county ordinance. We only had 10 seats in a sanctuary that holds over 400. And if you're 65 and older and you're in that high risk category, we have the FM station broadcasting in the parking lot. And we told them, please stay and we'll bring communion out to you, because we have it in, you buy them in individually wrapped containers.
You know, some of the other things that we've considered as well is a staggered opening. So maybe that we'll say, okay, Sunday, the first Sunday of the month will be for a certain county. Second Sunday of the month will be for another county. And that way it's also a phased in approach.
We do have questions about in particular singing and masks and the safety of singing in the first place at all, because that's the heart and soul of what we do. There's congregations and colleagues I'm speaking with that are thinking about, do we put up plexiglass actually?
I never imagined being in a drive-through, like you're in a parking lot. It'd be so much fun. The feedback was amazing, just for people to be there and then just, they're not there for the food or the gifts or the balloon, but just to be there and say, hi, how are you? And, you know, listen to the music and listen to the songs, and it was amazing. So people are ready. People are ready to get back together. And I think after 4 months, people are educated. People know how serious it is. And I would like to emphasize, as a physician myself, it's a serious disease. It's a deadly disease. You cannot let down your guard. Yes, life has to go on. We have to get back to work. We have to move on, but we cannot let down our guard.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.